Human trafficking is a pervasive human rights issue affecting millions, no matter their gender, age, or nationality.
Today we're gathered together for a truly important mission, ending the scourge of human trafficking.
A controversial shooting in Minneapolis sparked over 1,000 protests nationwide during a federal immigration operation. An ICE agent fired after a confrontation with a vehicle, leaving a local woman dead.
DHS taking action and sending 1,000 more Border Patrol agents to Minneapolis as protests in the Twin Cities and beyond heat up over the ICE-related shooting.
Federal officials called it self-defense, but public anger erupted instantly. That single shot did not close the case. It opened something much darker. As crowds filled the streets, federal investigators began detecting signs of a vast smuggling network operating under cover of the unrest, with corruption stretching into city government. This is where the real story begins. January 7th, 2026, Minneapolis, once a quiet Midwestern city, fell into an instability unseen in modern history. Streets familiar to residents became scenes of screaming crowds and protests that lasted throughout the night. What began as outrage over a deadly confrontation involving a local woman and a federal agent quickly erupted into a wave of intense violence across the entire city.
An ICE agent there shot and killed Renee Good just last week.
Right now, DHS is deploying hundreds of more federal agents to Minnesota as violent anti-ICE protests continue to rise in the state.
In just 10 days, the Department of Homeland Security announced the deployment of 10,000 Border Patrol officers and federal agents to Minneapolis to restore order, a force larger than the entire police departments of many mid-sized American cities. But deliberate resistance against specialized units followed, leaving 34 people dead. Online activity surged by as much as 190% across platforms like Twitter and YouTube. This surge in federal presence came after local parents reported children missing for days. Approximately 31 disappearance cases ignored or lost in the chaos, while desperate families marched along major avenues demanding answers. Behind the turmoil, investigators from the FBI and Immigration and Customs Enforcement noticed something chilling. The violence appeared perfectly staged to conceal a far deeper crime. Officials began to suspect that what protesters called chaos was in fact a smokescreen for a human trafficking network valued at nearly $1 billion, exploiting disorder to erase its tracks. In quiet discussions among federal teams, one question became impossible to ignore. Was the civil unrest being manipulated by someone with real power? And amid that chaos, while chants and sirens echoed through neighborhoods, few outside the intelligence community understood the truth. The riot may not have been the cause of the crisis at all, but a perfect distraction for something far more dangerous. If you believe a public official or a celebrity is behind these disappearances, tap like, subscribe to the channel, and comment "curious" to uncover the truth hidden behind it all. While the city burned and the crowds grew louder by the hour, the real operation continued in silence. Behind the chaos stood a figure no one expected, Judge Hassan Duale, a 44-year-old Somali-American judge known for discipline, precision, and 7 consecutive years on the bench. Within legal circles, he was regarded as methodical. In the community, he was described as fair. The press praised his consistency. Parents trusted him. Defendants feared him. That image was not accidental. It was camouflage. Federal investigators later concluded that the riots were not a threat to his operation. They were the catalyst. While police resources were stretched thin and public attention remained fixed on the streets, the judge activated a network he had spent nearly a decade building. Behind closed doors, investigators slowly uncovered a structure that had grown quietly for years, a nearly $1 billion human trafficking and narcotics network. At its core were 200 vulnerable individuals, men, women, and children pushed to the edge by poverty and desperation. Among them were 20 U.S. citizens deliberately recruited to handle logistics, paperwork, and transportation, creating a domestic shield for the operation. The route was global. From Minneapolis, people and drugs were moved through intermediaries to China, India, and Myanmar, forming a pipeline that transported not only human beings, but poison. Seized financial records and communications revealed the annual movement of more than 4.3 tons of narcotics, including heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl, into the United States. The estimated black market value reached hundreds of millions of dollars each year. Money was never moved in large blocks. It was broken down, circulated, and recycled through shell accounts across 3 continents. Small enough to evade quarterly audits. Small enough to trigger no alarms. At least 17 officials were identified as complicit, port authorities approving unchecked customs documents, financial directors redirecting dirty money, and intermediaries ensuring silence was rewarded. Then came the detail that chilled even veteran agents. Beneath the judge's private residence, hidden behind reinforced concrete and false walls, investigators discovered a deliberately constructed underground tunnel. This was no crude passage. It was equipped with ventilation, lighting, soundproofing, and detention areas. This was where people were held. This was where drugs were stored. This was where entire operations vanished from sight. For federal investigators, the conclusion was unavoidable. The riots did not randomly conceal this network. They concealed it because someone with power, patience, and legal authority understood exactly how chaos could be weaponized as cover. And by the time the city realized what had been hidden beneath its feet, the machinery was already in motion. If you believe federal agents can dismantle this human trafficking network, comment, destroy it. Your support strengthens the resolve of United States federal authorities. While the city still slept, federal commanders made their final decision. The situation was no longer ambiguous. What began as financial irregularities and missing person reports had led to a single conclusion. This network could not be dismantled quietly. It had to be cut out at the root. They moved. At 4:30 a.m., as Minneapolis remained silent under curfew, a convoy of unmarked black SUVs rolled through side streets with no sirens and no headlights. Inside were more than 300 ICE and DHS tactical agents, supported by federal investigators who had tracked the operation for months. Every second mattered. Intelligence warned that cash, documents, and people could disappear within minutes if even one alarm was raised. The target was a private residence blending into the neighborhood like any other. No banners, no signs, no warning to nearby residents that history was about to break open beneath their feet. When the first door was breached, the silence ended. Armed guards inside the house opened fire almost immediately. The firefight was brief, violent, and decisive. Flashbangs detonated. Commands echoed through the hallways. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" In under 90 seconds, resistance on the upper floors collapsed. Several suspects were wounded. No one escaped. Speed was everything. Delay would have meant destroyed evidence or worse. But the house was never the real target. Behind a reinforced wall on the lower level, agents found what intelligence had warned of but could never fully prepare them for: a concealed entrance. Concrete gave way, steel hinges groaned, and the structure beneath the home was revealed. A tunnel, not a crawl space, not an expanded basement, but a deliberately constructed underground corridor, extending outward with lighting, ventilation, and sound suppression. As agents advanced with weapons raised, they stepped into a space designed to erase human presence. Inside were 200 people, unconscious, drugged, lined along tunnel walls and side chambers, hands bound, mouths stuffed with cloth to prevent sound. Each person bore a clearly marked number, written directly on the skin. Inventory codes, not identities. Men, women, children. The youngest estimated to be under 8 years old. This was not chaos. This was order. As medics rushed in, search teams pushed deeper. Behind a false wall, agents uncovered 1.1 tons of narcotics, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl sealed in industrial packaging, stacked for rapid transport. The estimated black market value exceeded $400 million. Nearby, vacuum-sealed bricks of cash were discovered. Initial counts surpassed $100 million within the first hour alone. At 5:05 a.m., the operation reached its final phase. The judge was located inside the tunnel complex, attempting to flee through a secondary passage while associates scrambled to gather cash and documents. They failed. He was taken into custody without ceremony. Around him, 23 cartel enforcers were forced to their knees, weapons discarded, the network structure collapsing in real time. By sunrise, everyone in the tunnel was alive. Trafficking routes were shut down. Exits were sealed. What riots, noise, and fear had concealed was exposed with precision. The battle was brief, but the truth it revealed will not fade easily. Stay with this video if you support the federal agents risking their lives to sever the arteries of this network at the ports. What investigators uncovered after the tunnel was not an escape plan, it was a supply chain. If the underground passage beneath the house was where people disappeared, then the maritime containers were how they were erased from the map. Federal analysts would later describe the container system as the bloodstream of the entire operation, efficient, silent, and nearly invisible to casual inspection. The network relied on standard 40-foot shipping containers, the same kind that moved through American ports by the tens of thousands every single day. Inside, human beings were concealed behind legitimate cargo, pallets of clothing, boxed dry foods, canned goods, and shrink-wrapped consumer products. Nothing exotic, nothing suspicious. The kind of freight inspectors see hundreds of times per shift. Each container was built with internal false walls and floor compartments. In some cases, insulated cavities were installed to muffle sound. In others, ventilation tubes were disguised as packaging supports. Investigators documented at least 27 modified containers linked to this single network, each capable of carrying 6 to 10 people at a time, alongside narcotics, and the drugs were never secondary. Hidden among the cargo were vacuum-sealed packages of heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl, packed in standardized kilogram blocks. Shipping manifests showed repeat patterns, similar weights, similar destinations, similar timing. Analysts conservatively estimated that over 4.3 metric tons of narcotics were moved through these maritime routes every year, much of it bound for distribution hubs inside the United States. The scale was staggering. Customs records revealed that the containers passed through ports tied to 3 continents, using paperwork approved by compromised officials. At least 17 individuals in key positions had signed off on documents that should have triggered secondary inspections. They didn't. The containers moved. The seals stayed intact. The system looked clean. What made the operation especially dangerous was proximity. Some containers were temporarily staged less than 5 miles from residential neighborhoods, schools, and hospitals. In one documented case, fentanyl shipments were stored overnight in a warehouse directly adjacent to a family housing complex. Drugs and people waited side by side, separated only by plywood and plastic wrap. Financial trails confirmed that each successful container generated millions of dollars in profit. Payments were split, delayed, and rerouted through shell companies across Asia and the Middle East before returning as consulting fees or logistics expenses. No single transfer looked alarming. Together, they formed a river of money. For the victims inside the containers, there was no margin for error. Travel times stretched into days. Oxygen was rationed. Medical care was non-existent. Investigators later documented cases of dehydration, respiratory distress, and chemical exposure from narcotics stored only inches away. And still, the containers moved. To federal authorities, the conclusion was clear. This was not smuggling driven by desperation. It was industrial trafficking, built to scale, optimized for profit, and protected by routine. The same systems that move food and clothing across the world were weaponized to move people and poison. By the time the tunnel was discovered, dozens of containers were already en route. Some were intercepted, others were not. And that reality weighed heavily on the teams now reconstructing the route, because the tunnel had been shut down. But the sea, they knew, was much harder to stop. By sunrise, the raid had ended, but the investigation was only beginning. What followed was not chaos, but methodical exposure. Federal teams did not rush to announce victories. Instead, they slowed everything down. Every document seized from the tunnel, every phone recovered from the house, every financial record frozen in mid-transfer was treated as a piece of a much larger mechanism. Investigators confirmed what many had quietly suspected. This network had not survived for years because it was clever. It had survived because the system around it had been trained to look away. Over the next 72 hours, joint task forces initiated a citywide and regional review unlike anything Minneapolis had seen in decades. More than 1,400 shipping records were re-examined. 9 years of customs approvals were pulled from archives. Port logs, inspection waivers, and audit reports were laid side by side, revealing patterns that had never been questioned when viewed in isolation. The results were damning. At least 17 officials across multiple sectors were flagged for direct or indirect involvement. Some had accepted cash. Others received consulting fees. A few had simply delayed paperwork at the right moment. No single action looked criminal on its own. Together, they formed a corridor wide enough for an empire to pass through. Financial analysts uncovered over $380 million in transactions routed through shell companies across 3 continents. Funds were split into increments just below reporting thresholds, timed to miss quarterly reviews by days, sometimes hours. In one instance, $27 million moved through 4 jurisdictions in less than 36 hours, emerging clean on the other side as legitimate revenue. Law enforcement scrutiny did not stop with finances. Inspection schedules were audited. Patrol routes were mapped. Investigators discovered that surveillance blind spots were not accidental. Cameras failed where shipments passed. Patrols were reassigned during key transit windows. Internal emails showed requests marked low priority that should have triggered immediate escalation. This was not negligence. It was maintenance. As subpoenas multiplied, silence began to fracture. Mid-level operatives cooperated. Port clerks produced copies. Logistics managers surrendered ledgers they had been told to destroy. Each statement confirmed the same reality. No one at the top ever needed to give explicit orders. The system had learned what to protect. For longtime residents, the revelations were disorienting. People who had trusted institutions for decades now watched as familiar names disappeared from public directories. Offices closed without explanation. Others had been moved alone, tagged with numbers instead of names. Medical teams documented signs of prolonged sedation, dehydration, and exposure to narcotics residue. These were not side effects of neglect. They were byproducts of efficiency. The narcotics moved alongside them left their own trail of damage. Analysts linked the network's distribution routes to sharp increases in overdoses across multiple states. In one regional cluster, emergency room data showed fentanyl-related deaths rising by over 300% in just 3 years. In another, methamphetamine admissions doubled while violent crime followed close behind. Communities did not collapse overnight. They eroded, slowly, predictably, and quietly. Social workers described neighborhoods where addiction spread faster than any public response could keep up. Elderly residents spoke of streets they no longer recognized. Parents described children lost, not to violence, but to substances that arrived faster and cheaper than ever before. Each shipment did its work without headlines. Each delivery left a mark that could not be undone. What made the damage so enduring was the sense of abandonment. Many victims believed, until the very end, that someone in authority would intervene. A judge, a lawyer, a city official, someone. Instead, the very institutions meant to protect them had been weaponized to control them. For the agents conducting interviews, this phase of the investigation carried a different weight. Firefights ended quickly. Evidence could be cataloged, but listening to victims recount weeks spent underground, days without sunlight, or the moment they realized escape was impossible, left scars no Operation Debrief could address. This was not collateral damage. It was the product. The system had extracted value from desperation, then discarded what it could no longer use. The people who suffered most were not those who moved money or signed documents. They were the ones who trusted the wrong authority at the wrong time. As federal teams compiled testimony, one conclusion became unavoidable. The success of the network did not depend solely on violence or deception. It depended on silence. The silence of fear, the silence of routine, and the silence of a system that had stopped asking who was being hurt. By the time the victims were freed, years had already been taken from them. Some careers ended quietly, without press conferences or apologies. The damage was not loud. It was subtractive. By the end of the first week, over 60 active cases were reopened. Past seizures were reclassified. Missed inspections were re-examined. Convictions tied to compromised processes were flagged for review. What had once been dismissed as unrelated incidents now aligned into a single, continuous timeline. Federal officials described the process with one word: unraveling. Every thread pulled exposed another, and with each exposure, it became harder to deny what had allowed the network to thrive. This was not just a failure to enforce the law. It was a failure to question comfort, routine, and authority. The tunnel had been sealed. The containers were being tracked. Now, the system itself was under inspection, and for the first time in years, the shield that had protected the network was gone. Once the machinery was exposed, investigators turned to the part of the case no ledger could explain: the people who had been consumed by it. Behind the statistics were faces that had never appeared on shipping manifests or court calendars. The 200 individuals recovered from the tunnel were not criminals in the traditional sense. They were men and women who had arrived with little money, no legal protection, and nowhere else to turn. Many had fled war, famine, or economic collapse. Others had simply been promised work, safety, or a chance to start over. What they entered instead was captivity disguised as opportunity. Federal interviews revealed a pattern that repeated with disturbing consistency. Upon arrival, each person was assigned a debt, often between $25,000 and $60,000, for transportation, documents, and housing they never asked for. The debt was fictional, but the consequences were real. Those who questioned it were reminded that their families back home could be found. Those who resisted were isolated. Leaving was never presented as an option. Among the group were 20 U.S. citizens, recruited deliberately. They were chosen not for strength, but for credibility. Some were struggling with addiction. Others were unemployed or deeply in debt. They were offered quick money to drive vehicles, translate instructions, or store packages overnight. Most were never told the full scope of what they were supporting. By the time they understood, they were already implicated. The youngest victims were the hardest for investigators to describe. Several children were identified as being under 10 years old. None had traveled voluntarily. Some were separated from parents during transit.